I call Secretary of State Robert Jenrick to move second reading.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today marks the next significant step on our path to a robust but proportionate building safety regime. A regime that delivers high standards of safety for people's homes, particularly those which are high-rise, whilst providing reassurance to leaseholders, to residents and the market that the vast majority of homes in this country are safe. In February, I announced our 5-point plan to support leaseholders and address building safety issues. A plan to remove unsafe cladding where it is necessary and proportionate to do so, to provide certainty to leaseholders in the significant minority of buildings that do require works, to make industry pay its fair share for its failures and poor practices, and ensure a change in the broader culture and attitude of the industry to quality and safety, to create a world-class building safety regime, and to inject confidence and certainty into this part of the housing market that has been suffering from a market failure with significant detrimental effects for many homeowners across the land. I will in a moment. I'll come back to the right honourable gentleman as well. This bill delivers on our promise to create that world-class building safety regime, but one that is sensible and proportionate, reflecting the true level of risk that living in these buildings poses, and thereby safeguarding the broader interests of homeowners and residents. Today I'll set out the key measures in the bill and update the House on the progress of our plan, including providing further detail on a written ministerial statement that I have just published, representing a significant intervention by the government and lenders in response to expert advice on building safety in medium and low-rise blocks of flats, and the use of EWS1 forms that I commissioned earlier in the year. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman and then to...
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Does he accept that we have to get away from this term of cladding as a generic issue and start to focus on genuine fire risk? There is a real danger of us creating unnecessary anxiety and cost where there is little or no increase in fire risk, and what is worse, using taxpayers' money to remedy non-fire risks that should be the responsibility of the building industry.
Well, I couldn't agree more with my right honourable friend, and that is exactly the approach which we now need to follow as a country. I hope that the written ministerial statement, which I'll come on to explain in a moment, will provide further reassurance to my right honourable friend, and I'll bring in the honourable gentleman now.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving weight. I note the provisions in the bill for working with the Welsh Government on the levy and charges and so on going forward. But it's my understanding, and I've checked with them today, that the Secretary of State and the Treasury have yet to confirm to the Welsh Government, despite repeated requests, what is the consequential of the funding announcement that he made back so many months ago. My residents are deeply concerned, and until the Welsh Government have clarity on the money they're going to get from the UK Government, they cannot proceed with their own building safety fund to deal with these many issues.
And the important point that the honourable gentleman raises, that is really a matter to be directed to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who are responsible for the management of the Barnett consequentials. I would just point out, which is not a criticism of the honourable gentleman, who's understandably standing up for his constituents, but the Welsh Government have yet to bring forward a scheme which would use the funding they've already been given by the United Kingdom Government. I appreciate, of course, they'd always like to have further funding, but they haven't yet spent the money that the government's already given them. After the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower, the government appointed Dame Judith Hackett to review the current building safety regime and to recommend reform. Her findings were clear. Too often, regulations and guidance were misunderstood or misinterpreted. There was ambiguity around who is actually responsible for the safety of buildings, with insufficient oversight and enforcement. She called for an overhaul of the system, and her recommendations underpinned the bill before this House. We have tested these measures through consultation with industry, with regulators, with local government and the public, and we've also taken on board many of the recommendations made following scrutiny of the bill by the Housing Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and I'm grateful to the Select Committee for the work that they've...
Point of order. Order. We suddenly have a flurry of activity. interventions hold for a moment. Secretary of State, pause for a moment. Point of order, Shadow Secretary of State Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just wondered if I could get your advice. Is it normal practice that moments before an important debate with dozens of members down to speak, the Minister lays a ministerial statement, which is not yet online, so none of us are able to see it, about a matter before us, therefore avoiding any scrutiny of such said ministerial statement? Is that within order, Madam Deputy Speaker?
I'm sure that it is in order, and that's the question that the Honourable Lady is asking me as the Chair. It is in order for the Minister to lay a written statement when he decides it's the right time to do that. But if there is a question of information which the Honourable Lady is suggesting ought to be before the House in order to inform members about this bill that is before us now, I cannot make a judgment because I don't know what is in that statement. But if the Secretary of State would care to answer the point, it might help the House. Secretary of State. Further to that point of order, Sir Mike Penning.
Madam Deputy Speaker, all of the documents that are relevant to this debate on the second reading of this bill are on the table here, except the written ministerial statement that the Secretary of State has just referred to. For some of us that have been in the chamber for some hours now, I'm sorry, Secretary of State, that's not acceptable in the chamber.
The Honourable Gentleman is not speaking to the Secretary of State, he's speaking to me. Can't say Secretary of State. I cannot see what is on the table, and the clerk is not telling me that the right honourable gentleman is wrong. Let us just clear up this matter. Further to that point of order.
Speaker, I've just been out to the table office, Madam Deputy Speaker, and they have no copy of the statement. There is a notice of a statement coming entitled Housing Update, but it's yet to be provided to them or online, so members are unable to get hold of that important information that the Secretary of State has just referred to.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. Would the Secretary of State care to clarify this matter?
I'd be delighted to, Madam Deputy Speaker. A written ministerial statement will be laid shortly, which is market sensitive, and it's difficult to suggest that there's no scrutiny because I'm here before the House to explain that statement in the context of the wider debate. So if the Honourable Lady will give me a few moments, then I'm very happy to set out in the remarks that I'm about to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, exactly what we have agreed with lenders and the position that we've come to.
Order. Order. Secretary of State has explained that the reason for the specific timing of the laying of this statement is that it is market sensitive. If the Secretary of State says it is market sensitive, then I accept that it is market sensitive. I trust that it will be available very shortly, and I'm quite sure that we will be able to facilitate members holding the Secretary of State to account for the contents of that written statement when it becomes available, because he is here in the chamber, and I trust that it will become available before the Secretary of State concludes his opening remarks.
Absolutely, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And of course, I chose to make the statement directly to the House of Commons, and I'll come on in a moment to set out the contents of it. The written ministerial statement merely summarises that. Madam, if I can make some progress, then I'll come to the honourable gentleman. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the actions we've taken, and those that we take today, we've always prioritised public safety. And as I said earlier, the bill before us will create a strong regulatory regime for all new high-rise buildings. However, it's also important that we put the risk of a fire, and in particular the risk of a fatal fire, into context. It is very low for all buildings of all heights. Dwelling fires have reduced by more than a quarter over the last decade, are now at an all-time low. It's right that we address safety issues. I'll come to the honourable gentleman in a moment, if I may. It's right that we address safety issues where they exist and are a threat to life. But we must do so in a proportionate way, guided by the expert advice. That is why, through the bill, we're drawing a very clear line at 18 metres for the enhanced regulatory regime. This is upon the advice of building and fire experts, that these are the buildings that pose the greatest safety risks in the event of fire spread or of structural failure, albeit even here the risk should not be overstated, given the low occurrence of fires and the even lower occurrence of fatalities. We're also including hospitals and care homes that meet this height threshold during their design and construction. Come to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He mentioned discussions with the industry. So what can he say to companies in the Glasgow South West constituency like Bell Building Projects Limited who can't get the appropriate indemnity insurance because the insurance companies won't do it? Now, this is a company that specialises in cladding, so can the Secretary of State tell us what discussions he's having with the insurance companies so that, that this company can do cladding across the UK?
Well, I have been working intensively with the insurance sector, and it is incumbent upon them to bring forward products. We don't believe that the role of the state is to step in and correct the market failure in its totality, but we are bringing forward a product, and I'll say something more about this later in my remarks, with particular reference to professional indemnity insurance for those assessors who are conducting EWS 1 forms or equivalent, and that's designed to give them the confidence to approach those assessments in the most proportionate and risk-based approach, which some are not able to do so today. I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman, and then I'll return to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I spoke to the Secretary of State beforehand. Electrical Safety First charity has brought to my attention, and probably to others in this House, of the sustainable electrical safety. They refer to 54% of electrical fires are caused by an electrical source of ignition. Can I ask the Secretary of State, has he had the chance to speak to Electrical Safety First charity to ensure that safety is paramount and key in this bill? And if not, could he come back to me, please? Thank you.
Well, I would be happy to speak with the organisation that he refers to, or ensure my officials do so if they haven't done so already. Of course, we take the risk of electrical fires very seriously, and we've taken a number of steps as a government, particularly in the private rental sector, to ensure higher standards than there are today. I'll come to the Right Honourable Gentleman. I must make some progress.
Extremely grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. He's made the point a moment ago that the risk of a fatal fire is very low. But can he therefore explain why thousands and thousands of leaseholders are paying for expensive waking watches, having been told by their local fire services that unless there is a waking watch, the building will be closed down and all of them will have to leave? Because there is a clear contradiction between those two positions.
I think the Right Honourable Gentleman makes an important point, and that is one element of the market failure that we're seeing today. Waking watches are being used excessively. They can be rip-offs, and they can, in many cases, be replaced by modern fire alarms. That's why I created the Waking Watch Relief Fund last year, which is assisting with the issue. It is not closed it down entirely. And the NFCC have produced further guidance now, which essentially says that waking watches should be used in the most exceptional circumstances, and where they are used, they should only be for short periods. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is taking forward that work with Fire and Rescue Services, and I would like to see most waking watches, barring the most exceptional circumstances, brought to a close as quickly as possible. The bill, if I may make some progress, the bill will deliver improvements across the entire built environment. It will strengthen oversight and protections for residents in high-rise buildings. It will give those residents a greater say and will toughen sanctions against those who threaten safety. Its focus on risk will help owners to manage their buildings better, while giving the home building industry the clear, proportionate framework it needs to deliver more, better, high-quality homes. I will make some progress, if I may, but I will return to the Honourable Lady. While strengthening fire safety requirements in all premises regulated by the Fire Safety Order and improving competence and oversight generally, it rightly focuses the new, more stringent requirement on those buildings and those issues which pose the greatest risk. It provides a framework to ensure that during design construction, defined duty holders have clear responsibilities and compliance with building regulations occurs. They will have to clear a series of hard stops through the new gateway system for in-scope buildings. In occupation, every building in scope will have an identified accountable person with clear responsibility for safety matters. Importantly, Madam Deputy Speaker, it will be a criminal offence not to carry out these duties effectively, punishable by an unlimited fine and up to 2 years in prison. If we are truly to build a world-class regime, then residents must be at its heart. That's why, as well as championing social housing residents through the Social Housing Charter that I created last year, we're giving residents a stronger voice in the system through this bill, making it easier for them to seek redress and to have their voices heard. The bill will require an accountable person for a high-rise residential building to engage with their residents and establish a formal complaints process for residents to raise those concerns. These measures are strong but fair, and they will be overseen by the new Building Safety Regulator within the Health and Safety Executive. The regulator will be equipped with robust powers to crack down on substandard practices. And as I said earlier, it will ensure that proportionality is embedded within its operations. Madam Deputy Speaker, Dame Judith's review pointed to an industry that needed significant culture and regulatory change to be fit for purpose. And I'm sure I'm not the only member who has been shocked by the recent testimony at the Grenfell inquiry. This has exposed a corrosive culture of corner cutting and at times a cavalier attitude to building safety. We await the findings of the inquiry and indeed whether criminal proceedings will follow. The bill creates powers to strengthen regulatory oversight for firms who manufacture and sell construction products, overseen by the new National Regulator for Construction Products. And crucially, the bill will have powers to remove unsafe construction products from the market swiftly and to take action against those who break the rules. Our new regime will help those living in high-rise residential buildings to raise these issues, but we need to expand legal safeguards for everybody, regardless of the type of property they live in. We're strengthening redress for people buying a new-build home through provisions for the new Homes Ombudsman, which will provide dispute resolution and resolve complaints involving buyers and developers. We all know, as members of Parliament, of examples of shoddy workmanship by developers and of cases where complaints from snagging to much more serious issues have not been properly addressed. There will now be a forum where these issues can be settled and consumers provided with the outcome they deserve when making the biggest investment in their lives. I will give way. Thanks.
For giving way and thanking for the kind words he said about the Select Committee's scrutiny of the legislation earlier. On the new Homes Ombudsman, I think many of us have been shocked by what we've seen from developers of new housing and how cavalier attitude they have towards their development. Just confirm that the new Homes Ombudsman will have the powers to deal with this appalling practice of non-disclosure agreements that some people have been asked to sign in order to get the builder who's not built their homes properly to actually come in and put it right. And would you consider going a step further and requiring the builders of new homes where faults are existing in a new home to have to go and put right all the similar faults in existing homes, just as the car manufacturer would have to do?
I think those are two important points. I would like to see the new Homes Ombudsman be able to take that kind of action that he describes. I'll have to revert to him whether the powers exactly allow that. If they don't, then I think that's the kind of issue that we should progress over the course of the passage of the bill. I'll come to the Honourable Lady because I apologise for keeping her waiting.
So just returning to the issue of Waking Watch and risk. London now has 900 Waking Watches. The number has risen significantly. And the London Fire Brigade says that there remain a number of buildings under 80 metres or 7 storeys that, in the view of the LFB, present equal or greater risk than those currently in scope. Can the Secretary of State tell us if he believes that the London Fire Brigade is wrong?
I understand it, and I stand corrected if I have the wrong information, but that the 900 figure that she quotes was a misinterpretation of the figures that were released earlier. But nonetheless, it's a significant number, albeit I think less than 900. What we want to see are Waking Watches used only in those cases where they're absolutely necessary. And the National Fire Chiefs Council's statement recently has suggested that they're being used too often, and they can be reduced significantly. Of course, if she has constituents, who I'm sure she does, in this situation, in the first instance, I'd recommend that they make use of the Waking Watch Relief Fund to install a fire alarm, and that can cut the costs very considerably. This bill also takes an unusual step of retrospectively extending the period during which compensation for defective premises can be claimed by over double the current period, from 6 to 15 years. This is a significant step forward, requested and campaigned for by groups impacted by the cladding issue. We're going further, expanding the scope of the work for which compensation can be claimed, also to include future major renovation work to buildings. These measures will not help everyone, but they do provide a step change in redress for raising issues. I hope builders in time will extend their warranties to cover this period and provide the maximum amount of confidence to house purchasers. I will to my right friend, then I really must make progress.
I'm grateful. While he's considering this point about the extension, can he please consider the point made by Sir Robert Ayling at Grosvenor Waterside that the Building Act 1984 should be extended to 6 years after the plaintiff is aware of the defect? I'm not asking for an instant answer now, but that would help to deal with the present situation very well.
I will give that further thought and revert to my honourable friend. Madam Speaker, it was clear after the fire at Grenfell Tower that action was required to address safety concerns with respect to existing buildings, and quite rightly my predecessors took a safety-first approach, as I have tried to do as well. We have provided expert advice and accelerated inspections of all high-rise buildings, and that work continues, with substantial progress having been made by the National Fire Chiefs Council on the Building Risk Review, which is likely to be concluded by the end of the year. We've provided £5 billion in grant funding to carry out vital remediation work, targeted at the buildings we know to be the greatest risk from fire spread, those over 18 metres. And we've banned the use of combustible materials on the external walls of high-rise residential buildings, providing industry with a clear standard for the construction of new builds. 474 buildings have been identified with Grenfell-type ACM cladding. We are now well on the way to remediating all of those buildings. Over 95% of the buildings identified at the beginning of last year have either completed or started remediation work. 70% of those have now been fully remediated, and that is rising every week. This means around 16,000 homes have been fully remediated of unsafe ACM cladding, an increase of around 4,000 since the end of last year. Despite many building owners failing to provide adequate basic information, almost 700 buildings with other types of unsafe cladding are proceeding with a full application to the Building Safety Fund. We've already allocated £540 million, which means owners of 60,000 homes within high-rise blocks can be reassured that their remediation will be fully funded. We currently forecast that over 1,000 buildings with non-ACM unsafe cladding will receive support of the same form through the Building Safety Fund, providing a guide to the cohort of high-rise buildings where remediation is actually required. This is being progressed by a dedicated team in my department and our two delivery partners, Homes England and the Greater London Authority. The government has played its part. The unprecedented £5.1 billion we're providing gives assurance to leaseholders in eligible buildings that unsafe cladding on their blocks will be replaced at no cost to them. I know there will be strong feelings across the House about industry needing to fix and pay their fair share for problems they've helped to cause. I want to recognise that some house builders have stepped up too, committing over £500 million since my statement in February thus far for remediation. Some have not stepped up, or at least not in the way I expect them to do. I think, for example, of Ballymore, who have yet to commit to fully funding the remediation of their buildings. The industry needs to go further. That's why we're introducing a new levy on high-rise residential buildings, and we've published today a consultation document on the levy, and I welcome views from all interested parties on its design. The levy will sit alongside a tax that is being developed by the Chancellor to raise at least £2 billion to contribute to the costs of historic remediation. This bill also introduces the building safety charge to provide residents with clarity and certainty on the costs of building works. And we've listened and ensured that the building safety charge only includes the cost of management of building safety in their building. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said at the outset, in bringing forward this new building safety regime, we need to take a sensible, proportionate approach driven by expert advice. The bill ensures that the Building Safety Regulator will regulate in line with best practice principles, be proportionate and transparent, and ensure that the interests of leaseholders are protected. In 2020, only 9% of fires were in flats of 4 stories or more. In 2019 to 2020, only 7% of fires spread beyond the room of origin in such buildings. And while every death is tragic, of course, only 10 people thankfully died in 2020 as a result of a dwelling fire in flats of 4 stories or more. We strongly believe that our proportionate approach is in line with these facts, ensuring that remediation works are only undertaken where absolutely required. And leaseholders should not be landed with bills for unnecessary work. Unfortunately, this is not the position today, and we need a significant reset. Too many people living in lower and medium-rise buildings have told us of feeling trapped in their properties, held back from selling their homes because of excessive caution in the lending, surveying, insurance and fire risk assessment market. Understandably, this has caused residents to worry over safety and has led to unnecessary costs. I want to be clear that the vast majority of residents in all homes in this country, including blocks of flats, should not feel unsafe. Driven by these concerns, earlier this year, I asked a small group of experts on fire safety to consider the evidence and advise me on steps that should be taken to ensure a proportionate, risk-based approach is taken to fire safety in blocks of flats. I want to thank them for their time and their expert advice, which I will publish later today. The key finding of this advice is clear. We cannot and should not presume systemic risk of fire in blocks of flats. I've quoted some of the statistics earlier, but let me repeat them. Dwelling fires are at the lowest point they've been since we started to collect comparable statistics in 1981. This is despite the fact in 2020 that people spent significantly greater amounts of time in their homes as a result of COVID restrictions. On this basis, expert advice includes 5 significant recommendations to correct the disproportionate reaction that we've seen in some parts of the market. Firstly, EWS1 forms should not be a requirement on buildings below 18 metres. Secondly, if I may finish this point, I'm also conscious of time because I know many members want to contribute to the debate. Secondly, in the small number of cases where there are known to be concerns, these should be addressed primarily through risk management and mitigation. Thirdly, there should be a clear route for residents and leaseholders to challenge costly remediation work and seek assurance that proposals are indeed proportionate and cost-effective. Fourth, government should work with the shadow building safety regulator to consider how to implement an audit process to check that fire risk assessments are following guidelines and not perpetuating the risk aversion we're witnessing, and in some instances are taking unnecessary costs to leaseholders. And finally, fire risk assessors and lenders should not presume that there is significant risk to life unless there is credible evidence to support this. This would ensure that they only respond to the evidence and adopt a far more proportionate and balanced approach. This advice is supported by the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Institute of Fire Engineers. The government supports and will act on these recommendations. Delivering real change for leaseholders requires a concerted effort from all those actively involved in the market. And government has been working in recent weeks intensively with lenders, valuers and fire experts in this regard. We welcome the expert advice and support the position that EWS1s should not be needed for buildings less than 18 metres. I'm pleased that all major lenders have today welcomed this advice, with Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds and others agreeing that the expert advice and government statement should pave the way for EWS1 forms to no longer be required for buildings below 18 metres, which will further unlock the housing market. I won't, if I may. I'm extremely grateful to those in industry who've already engaged and shown the necessary leadership. This is a highly complex issue, but the Prime Minister and I expect that the appropriate next steps will be taken expediently. This market is shaped not only by government, but by lenders, by RICS, the Fire and Rescue Service, and by fire experts. All of us need to act to achieve a market correction and relieve the pressure upon homeowners. There can be no bystanders in this action. I'm hopeful that other lenders will follow soon, and that RICS will rapidly reflect on the expert advice and update their guidance accordingly. This concerted cross-market approach will open up the housing market for the remaining affected leaseholders. I won't, so I need to conclude my remarks now. With the Health and Safety Executive, we will explore ways to deliver a fire risk assessment.
Order. Sorry, point of order, Mr. Doughty.
Is it with you this way, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a point of order? But the written statement that the Secretary of State has laid here makes no clarification about whether this applies to England only, or to England and Wales, or indeed to the whole of the UK. And given that it's UK-wide, it's market sensitive, there are many leaseholders who will be concerned in all parts of the UK, and it applies to UK-wide lenders with significant financial implications. How can I get an answer from the Secretary of State on that for leaseholders who will be watching this debate in other parts of the United Kingdom? It would be very helpful if the Secretary of State could just confirm it, or would have taken a simple intervention to clarify that point. Madam Deputy Speaker.
I thank the honourable gentleman for what I consider to be properly a point of order. The Secretary of State has most courteously explained to the House that the statement which is now forthcoming is market sensitive. I've had a chance to glance at it and I understand that it is indeed market sensitive, and so I can understand, and I think the whole House will now understand why the Secretary of State issued it at the point that he did. I have to say to the House that there seems to have been some delay in the vote office and in the workings of the House, and for that, on behalf of the House authorities, I apologise to members and to the Secretary of State, and I thank the opposition whips for giving me a copy, since nobody else did. But I'm still finishing this point of order, Sir Peter. I think there are some points that are in this statement which the Secretary of State will wish to clarify, and I'm not putting a time constraint on him as I normally would for finishing his second reading speech, because in addition to his second reading speech, it would be appropriate for him to take 2 or 3 questions upon his written statement. So, further to that point of order, Sir Peter Bottomley.
This is a written statement HCWS 228. An online search brings up one of the symbol number in January 2015. Could the House authorities see if they can get it online so that those members who are participating virtually also have the chance of reading it?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that point of order, and I reiterate it. I wonder if the House authorities have done that. I don't know. I'm asking them to do so immediately. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Matt. I'll come to the honourable gentleman, if I may. But in answer to the question posed by his colleague, my domain as Secretary of State on these matters is within England, but of course the lenders will apply practices at their discretion across the whole of the United Kingdom. So I think his question is probably better directed to the lenders who, following this announcement, will no doubt be setting out in the coming days how they intend to amend their lending practices, and in different parts of the United Kingdom. I don't think it's for me to explain the lending practices that they choose to adopt, other than the quotations that have been given by the lenders, which I believe they'll be publishing later today. I'll come to the honourable gentleman then, if I may, I'll conclude my remarks.
Giving way. I just say, Madam Speaker, to the Secretary of State, this is a very significant statement, and it's difficult to read it quickly and grasp it. But I'll just quote from it to the Secretary of State, talking that EWS1 form should not be needed for buildings less than 18 metres. This position is a significant step and one supported by the National Fire Chiefs Council, etc. It is a significant step. Could the Secretary of State just explain, if this form is not necessary on those buildings, is the Secretary of State effectively saying that apart from cladding removal, significant remediation works are not necessary on buildings below 18 metres as well? Is that what the government is saying? Because that is a major step in this debate, which I think it needs a lot more explanation to the House.
The expert advice that I commissioned has concluded that there's no systemic risk to life from purpose-built flats in this country, and in particular, which was the question I asked of them, those flats which are low and medium rise, those of 11 to 18 metres. Their advice following from that is that they don't see a need for EWS1 forms to being asked by lenders in the ordinary course of business. They also recommend that fire risk assessments are conducted in the usual compliance cycle rather than on demand in order to satisfy a market transaction like purchasing or remortgaging a property. They do not conclude, as one would expect them to do, that all buildings below 18 metres are safe. One could never say that. There will be buildings that need remediation below that level. But because there's no systemic risk, because the number of buildings is likely to be very small, it is not appropriate, in their opinion, and the government has accepted this, that lenders and other parties within the market should be acting as if there was a widespread and systemic issue. That is a subtle but important change of tone, and one which I hope, and the initial support of the lenders would suggest this will happen, will lead to a significantly different housing market. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady then, if I may. I'll conclude my remarks.
For giving way. And indeed, on the first reading of this, there are bits of this statement that are very welcome, but many questions. And I do put on record, Madam Deputy Speaker, my regret that we've only had this chance to digest it. But the Public Accounts Committee and our sister committee, the Housing and Communities Local Government Committee, have been looking at this issue, along with other honourable members in this House, now for several years. We've been making recommendations along these lines. Our constituents have been paying for safety works and dealing with the fear and the anguish created by the very issues that our committees have raised as problems. So it's a start, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Secretary of State has come to the House with this. But why so late when this issue has been raised by members of this House and the Select Committee corridor for some time? I'm just puzzled, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the late timing of this.
Well, I don't agree with the Right Honourable Lady in this regard. In the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy, advice was published by government which sought to provide information to the market where there was a significant absence of expert opinion. The market in the years since then has reacted and taken what I've described as a safety-first approach. In more recent times, what we have seen, and Dame Judith Hackett, our expert advisor, has used these words herself recently, is extreme risk aversion. And that's leading to fear and anxiety, above all, by members of the public who have a sense of risk with respect to their homes, which is not borne out by the evidence in terms of the number of fires or the likelihood of dying in a fire in a high-rise or a purpose-built flat. And secondly, in other market participants, whether that be lenders, insurers, surveyors or assessors, seeking remediation of those buildings over and above what might seem to be absolutely necessary to achieve an acceptable level of life safety. What I did earlier this year, as I set out in my remarks today, and you'll see in the written ministerial statement, which merely summarises in somewhat more detail what I've already said to the House directly, which is why I chose to say it to the House directly rather than simply via written ministerial statement, was to ask a series of experts to conduct a serious review and analysis of this issue and to present their findings to me. That's what they've done today, and I'm publishing them later. And we've chosen to accept those and have worked very closely with as many market participants as we could do, bearing in mind the market sensitivity of the issue. And as I say, I'm pleased that a large number of those organisations have welcomed this step and have chosen in one form or another to support it. I don't want to overstate that, because this is a highly complex market and government is merely one player within it. It will now require all of those market participants to think carefully about what the consequences of this are for their own practices and organisations. I, of course, hope that in time they will strongly support the government's position and that this will lead to a significant market correction to the benefit of all of our constituents and the whole country. If I may simply conclude my remarks by noting a few other points that are within the written ministerial statement. With the Health and Safety Executive, we will explore ways to deliver a fire risk assessment audit process that ensures assessments are carried out in a risk-proportionate way, avoiding unnecessary and costly remediation works where they're absolutely not needed. We will explore options to provide a clear route for residents and leaseholders to challenge costly remediation work. This will be progressed alongside the steps we're taking to ensure a proportionate response to risk is embedded in the market, including developing guidelines for fire risk assessors, such as, and principally, PAS 9980, and the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note. Launching a government-backed professional indemnity insurance scheme for qualified professionals conducting external wall system fire risk assessments to help ensure there is sufficient capacity in the market to allow EWS1 forms to be completed in a timely manner where they are necessary, and those conducting them feel the confidence and security to be able to do so in the most sensible and proportionate manner. Taken together, Madam Deputy Speaker, all of these measures should provide a measure of reassurance to the market and to those living in blocks of flats of any height. I'm hopeful that this will have a significant impact, but of course, much depends on the willingness of the other market participants to show leadership and commitment and to work together through these complex challenges. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fire at Grenfell Tower was a terrible tragedy, and those who lost loved ones remain in our thoughts. The issues that became clear following the tragedy are multifaceted, and so our response must be as well. But it is clear the actions we have and will continue to take, and the world-class building safety regime delivered by this bill, should deliver a robust but proportionate regime and mean that people in this country, now or ever, should never feel unsafe in their home. I commend this bill to the House.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Just before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, I'd say further to the point of order from the Right Honourable Gentleman for Worthing West, the written ministerial statement is now available on the House Papers app, and very shortly it will be available on the Parliament website. I hope that will mean that members who are participating virtually will be able to access it. And again, I apologise on behalf of the House authorities for the shambles when the statement was actually put in the vote office, because it wasn't then distributed properly here in the chamber, and we can't blame the Secretary of State for that, because I do appreciate the timing because of the market sensitivity. Since I requested that the Secretary of State stay at the dispatch box rather longer in order to take points specifically on the statement, he has, of course, made a much longer speech than one would have anticipated, and therefore the time limit for backbench speeches will not be 4 minutes, it will be 3 minutes. But I hope that members feel that many of them have already had a chance to ask pertinent questions of the Secretary of State. Shadow Secretary of State, Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I first of all say I don't think the shambles here lies with the House authorities. The shambles here, I'm afraid, lies with the Secretary of State. It's just not acceptable. I think it's a contempt of this place that we are given a ministerial statement and a new announcement in his speech, which is absolutely, totally relevant to this bill today and the topics that we are discussing. Members on both sides of this House have spent weeks scrutinising the bill, scrutinising what it means, preparing what they're going to say in response, and then they're given this ministerial piece of paper halfway through the Secretary of State's speech. The Deputy Leader of the House says, the Deputy Chair of the House says that this is market sensitive. I mean, maybe I'm naive about these things, but I don't understand what's market sensitive at 3:10 or 2:30 that's not market sensitive at 3:30, because I thought the markets closed at 4:30, but you know, maybe I've got that wrong. Anyway, I'll come on to some of the things in his statement shortly, but I'll make some progress, because not only has his shambles now made it really hard for people to properly scrutinise, but it's also cut people's time down. So I think he's probably lost a lot of friends on both sides of the House in the process of doing that. But the starting point of this bill and for our debate today is the awful tragedy at Grenfell Tower. Again, we remember the 72 lives lost and stand with the families, friends and community at Grenfell campaigning for change. I also want to put on record my admiration and awe of homeowners and tenants across the country who are dealing every day with the building safety scandal that engulfs our towns and cities. Their tireless campaigning under such very difficult circumstances is beyond impressive. Of course, people had been ringing the bell about building safety long before Grenfell, including the residents themselves. By 2017, the government already had 2 coroner's reports on previous fires calling for reform, yet it did not act. In the wake of Grenfell, the government commissioned a review of building regulations, the Hackett Review, and this bill implements her recommendations. Given that her final report was published over 3 years ago, why has it taken so long for this bill to reach us? Hackett's report is damning, finding that the entire system is not fit for purpose. She concludes, the ultimate test of this new framework will be the rebuilding of confidence in the system. The people who matter most in all of this are residents in these buildings. Her conclusion is the test against which this bill, and now his new ministerial statement, must be set. It's far too simple and wrong to say that all of this is the fault of shoddy developers, as the government has more recently asserted. The tragedy at Grenfell, the fires before, and the near misses since have happened as a result of many years of deregulation, lack of enforcement and accountability, and a culture where sign-off and inspection can be bought. These issues have been brought to light in the shocking evidence heard by the Grenfell inquiry, which of course is ongoing. We support the majority of what is in this bill, which at last strengthens regulation of high-rise buildings, although it could go further. However, we do have serious concerns about what is not in the bill. It abandons those leaseholders already trapped in the building safety crisis, and we will seek every avenue to provide the cast-iron legal guarantees that have long been promised. So starting with what's in the bill, I will very briefly give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she agree with me as well that the situation that leaseholders are finding themselves in is compounding an ongoing awful situation in which they find themselves without leverage, with service charges that are often unjustified, and a difficulty in getting resolution for those? This has created much more uncertainty and stress and anxiety for hundreds of thousands of families across the country.
She makes an excellent point, and leaseholders have very little recourse, and even from the announcements today, I think that their passage of recourse remains incredibly uncertain. So starting with what's in the bill, the first major change sets up the Building Safety Regulator, a key recommendation of the Hackett report. The regulator will oversee higher risk buildings, which have been defined as essentially over 18 metres. But the Select Committee raised questions about whether the scope should be extended. The FBU say 11 metres or 4 storeys would be a safer threshold, as this is the threshold they can reach with their ladders. The Secretary of State himself said last year that we shouldn't rely on crude height limits with binary consequences, which don't reflect the complexity of the challenge at hand. The two-tiered system this bill creates is particularly stark when we look at privatised building control, which will continue to operate below 18 metres. Hackett recognised that choice over building control inspection is a major weakness in the current system, allowing cosy relationships to flourish between developers and the private inspectors they handsomely pay. The regulator will be the building control body for taller buildings, but not for those under 18 metres, even where other risks could remain. I think the government should think again about its arbitrary definition of high-risk buildings. Secondly, this bill establishes clear responsibilities for building safety throughout a building's life, in a golden thread of information. Lack of transparency was a key issue identified by Hackett. The Grenfell inquiry has exposed how some building owners belittle residents as troublemakers rather than keep them informed about the safety of their homes. The new system must be fully open and transparent to residents and leaseholders. The need for transparency extends to the testing regime, which Hackett found to be opaque and insufficient. While the bill sets a framework for the regulation of construction products, the government has kicked the issue of product testing down the road. This must be re-examined. Third, the bill sets up limited mechanisms to recoup costs from developers through legal action and a levy. The principle of the polluter must pay should apply to the building safety scandal. Labour has long been calling on the government to take stronger action against developers who cut dangerous corners. Extending the period in which a developer can be sued is welcome, but residents in many buildings will not be able to take advantage. The relationship of leaseholders and developers is like David and Goliath. Legal action is uncertain, expensive and risky, requiring money leaseholders simply don't have. It also requires that a company still exists to sue, yet many have disappeared since. What's more, given what we know from Hackett and elsewhere, in how many cases can all the blame be legally pinned on a developer, given the failures of the regulatory regime at the time? Very few, I'd imagine. Finally, the bill makes some changes around the New Homes and Social Housing Ombudsman. After significant delay, some social housing reforms have finally come through. But how will the Secretary of State ensure that the social housing regulator has real teeth? So while there are things we welcome in this bill that will improve building safety into the future, there are, as I'm sure we'll hear from members across the House, serious concerns about what is missing and the way in which ruinous costs for remediation works will still fall on leaseholders. What began as a cladding scandal after Grenfell has now led to a total breakdown in confidence in most tall and multi-storey buildings. This has now become a building safety crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Young, first-time buyers have gone bankrupt. Couples have put having children on hold. Marriages have broken down. Life savings and assets have gone. Retirements ruined. The mental health and financial toll is incalculable. Fundamentally, this bill betrays leaseholders who will still face life-changing costs for problems they did not create and who are trapped in unsellable, uninsurable, unmortgageable homes, notwithstanding some of his announcements today, which I fear will do little to resolve it. 2 Prime Ministers, his 2 immediate predecessors, as well as the Secretary of State himself, have all said that leaseholders should not pay. I agree. I think we all agree in here. So why does the bill not say it? On at least 17 different occasions in this House, they promised, even to their own backbenchers, that they would protect leaseholders. We heard through the course of the Fire Safety Act that the Building Safety Bill was the place to do so. So where is it? It's not in there. What's more, legal advice on what is in the bill says the betrayal of leaseholders is even worse. As drafted, this bill bakes in leaseholders' potential liability. Our legal advice is that Clause 124 provides very little additional protections. Their legal opinion is that this bill, in its totality, including Clause 99, makes, and I quote, more certain that remediation costs will fall under service charges and be passed on. So on their fundamental promise to leaseholders, this bill fails. No wonder they're furious and bereft. I, of course, welcome the Building Safety Fund. It's a good thing and could provide a solution for many buildings. I've got to commend the Secretary of State on getting £5.1 billion out of the Chancellor. He seems to have better negotiating skills than his boss, the Prime Minister. It's a lot of money and could go some way to resolving the situation if it's properly used. But I just don't understand why his financial commitment is not being met by the same zeal and determination to give it proper effect. His approach has so far been blighted by inertia, indifference, and now beset by increasing costs, relying on those in the industry who have created much of this mess to get us out of it. I've got to tell him it's just not working. Even his own backbenchers accused him of shocking incompetence. And I feel this view might be spreading after today's shenanigans with his statement. Let me explain. The scope of the fund is way too narrow. The deadlines for applying too tight, yet it's being administered far too slowly, with just 12p in every pound of the fund allocated. At its current pace, it will be 2027 before the fund is even allocated. And because there's no grip on the wider issues, as we've been discussing today, like risk, cost, work quality, accountability and sign-off, nearly all multi-storey buildings are now affected. And even when cladding is removed, a new ever-growing list of additional seemingly necessary works are added. This means innocent and drained leaseholders are constantly at the mercy of a system with no accountability and no confidence in it. With an industry unable to take on risk, cornering a broken market for works, arguing over responsibility, unwilling to insure, mortgage or step up, all the while leaving leaseholders carrying the can. That's why this crisis is now affecting so many and costs keep going up. The truth is that all the sense of appropriate risk has gone out of the system. The Secretary of State have talked about that today, and I've heard him say this many times before. But I'm not sure really what he's doing about it. I mean, notwithstanding what's in his statement today, I still don't know that this is going to provide the transparency, the recourse or the scrutiny that leaseholders need. He says there should be a clear route for residents to challenge. What would that route be? How would it work? What teeth will it have? He said there will be more guidelines. What are they? When will they be published? Can we see them? Will this really have the effect that leaseholders need it to have? Because time is a luxury that these homeowners simply don't have. Because it's not just about the one-off high remediation costs that they're facing today, but insurance premiums have gone through the roof, service charges rocketing, and the waking watch, which we've heard so much about, and other costs are leaving leaseholders paying hundreds of pounds a month extra today as we speak already. And recent government guidance has made the situation worse. Their advice note from January 2020 effectively brought all buildings at any height into scope of the dreaded EWS1 form. After today's announcement, is that now scrapped? Is that guidance no longer exist? Is that, well, I don't know if it's in there. I didn't read it in there. He's pointing to it from a sedentary position. I didn't see whether that was in there. If it is, people need to know that now so that we can discuss it. And we should have known it before this debate. It's a very important thing to know. And if he wants to come to the dispatch box to tell us whether that January 2020 advice note is now effectively scrapped, he can do, because it's essential that people need to know that. Yes, if she knows the answer, I'll happily give way to her.
Thank you for giving way. I'm not completely positive, but it did say in the statement that the EWS1 form should not be required on buildings of 18 metres, which is a welcome change of common sense, I think, that is prevailing on this debate now, and I welcome that announcement. And does she agree with me that this is something that we've been campaigning on for quite some time, and that it's a welcome change to the legislation?
Well, it's not actually legislation. She's wrong about that. But yes, we of course we would welcome that. The crucial word that I think she said there was should. Not would not, but should not. And that's a different thing entirely. So we still need to know on what terms will that be enforced, what recourse would a leaseholder have, and to whom, and what teeth will they have in order to make that into effect. Is it legislation? I think the Secretary's trying to tell me that it's going to be legislation. I haven't. Oh, so it's just down. Yes, it's just down to the. I'll give way to him if he wants to explain.
The Honourable Lady seems to misunderstand what an EWS1 form is. An EWS1 form is a product of the lenders and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. It is not the law, neither is it a product created by the government.
I'm fully aware, thank you, what an EWS1 form is. Its scope and its requirement to be necessary came about from the advice note that the government issued in January 2020. Its scope and its effect came about from that point. And so if it's a matter for the lenders, then what recourse, as I say, do leaseholders have? Because there's nothing in his statement about recourse and accountability and where the buck stops. And that is my central argument here, because there is a vacuum of leadership. Everybody from insurers to mortgage lenders, risk assessors and others are too concerned about their liability, leaving thousands of buildings with endless fire safety requirements, some of which are potentially life-threatening, but others are an unnecessary symptom of this crisis in confidence. Who is it who's to say which is which? Where does that sit? With whom does that lie? They cannot leave this to industry and the private sector to sort. The market can't sort this because it's completely broken. And he said to himself today the market was completely broken, like this was new news to him. Yet he says he won't intervene in that broken market. The power is with him to intervene if he wanted to. And that's why we've been calling for a building works agency, a crack team of engineers and experts appointed by the government, going block by block, assessing the real fire risk and what remediation works are absolutely necessary, commissioning and funding those works from the Building Safety Fund, and then crucially certifying the building as safe and sellable. This rigorous approach would also keep costs down, and then the agency can then go after those responsible for costs. It's been done before in Australia, and it can be done here again if he was prepared to step up, lead and intervene rather than leave it to the broken market he describes. Yes, I will give way.
Thank you, Madam Friend, for giving way. I keep reading this statement, and I'm not sure I'm any clearer than I was at the beginning. The Secretary of State said that EWS1 forms are not needed on properties below 18 metres because there was no systemic risk across those sorts of buildings. What I'm not clear about is whether the lack of systemic risk applies to cladding, which is not of limited combustibility. Is the Secretary of State saying now there's no need to remove combustible cladding from those buildings below 18 metres, or there is? In which case, if there is, isn't an EWS1 form needed as part of that process? If it isn't, we still don't know who's going to pay for the work.
Well, he makes a very good point. And, of course, there are many buildings over 18 metres as well that haven't got cladding, that are still facing the issues of fire remediation works, some of which may not be necessary. And I'm not clear whose job it is to decide whether they are necessary or not, and therefore whether a building can be mortgageable and insurable once again and people can move on with their lives. I'm still not sure of that, and I still don't feel that the government is really providing the leadership and intervention that is necessary. But there's huge strength of feeling on these issues, as we can see from the number of people wanting to speak in this debate today. The toll of this crisis is immeasurable. Innocent homeowners want us to work together, and I will work with anyone to protect them from these costs. I'm not interested in party political point scoring as it happens, but the government has to step up on these issues. Returning to that Hackett test I talked about, Her ultimate test of this new framework is the rebuilding of public confidence in the system. She says the people who matter most in all of this are the residents of these buildings. The honest truth is, through the omission of cast iron protections for today's leaseholders, this test won't be met. It's not enough to simply will the ends. The means need real determination and focus too. We will work with all sides to protect leaseholders and meet the Hackett test. Thank you.